Hi, Misha here, and you read the topic, the title of this video. We're going to look at the firearms from the 3 Indiana Jones movies. Raiders of the Lost Ark, 1981. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, 1984. And Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, 1989, which, I gotta admit, was a pretty good year for movies. We're not just going to cover his personal sidearms. We're going to look at pretty much all the small arms, pistols, submachine guns, and rifles featured in the films, because I was kind of looking around and I realized I have a majority of the ones featured, or at least ones similar. What you're about to see won't be exactly the variant maybe, or the same finish or barrel length, but it's going to be at least the right model and type and what have you. Mostly just having fun, hanging out, talking about something that I think is important to people of a certain age, Generation X and early millennials. I know that, for example, Indiana Jones is really maybe Fox's favorite franchise, if not his absolute favorite, probably in his top 3. So that kind of inspired me to do this, plus just trying to think of something, and I love talking Milsurp, and I thought this might be a good way, combining it with Hollywood and childhood nostalgia, to introduce some people to Milsurp. So yeah, we're going to talk about the guns scene, their real world history, what they did in the films, and if they fit in the films, or if they're anachronistic. And with that, we're going to go in chronological order with the Indiana Jones timeline. And as always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. Like to help us out, check out Patreon. And we're doing live streaming now, so next time if you'd like to stop in and say hi, that'd be good. With that, let's go back to the 1930s. 1935, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. A prequel before prequels were the popular thing. What's interesting about Temple of Doom is it probably features the least amount of firearms, at least when it comes to screen time, and most of them are at the beginning during the club scene, and the majority of those are various revolvers, specifically 38 revolvers. So here are 3 of mine. They're not exact. Well, one of them is to the film, but this is correct for 1935. 38 revolvers were king, and the mix of American and British also kind of plays true. And we see Dr. Jones with 2 different revolvers, although this was mostly just because of props. I think it was supposed to be the same one. And in the past, it was felt it would have been a .455, but it actually seems to be a .38 in both instances. We see him with a Colt official police, and we see him, or rather, we see his Smith & Wesson being dropped out of the car. So mine here are almost right. Instead of a Colt official police, I actually have a Colt Commando, which was the World War II contract version of the official police. And in the film, he's supposed to have a Smith & Wesson M&P because of the era, but in reality, he does have a Victory model pretty much just like this one. Both are chambered for .38 special, and the official police would have definitely been a good selection for police forces in East Asia, and would have been a popular carry gun for law enforcement, detectives, even civilians in that era. And the civilian version would be similar to this, except instead of having the blasted finish, it would have had a high gloss blued finish, and barrel lengths on some of Dr. Jones's guns were cut down from time to time. it was a double single action gun with the, of course, firing pin on the hammer. And we have the traditional Colt release where you pull back, flip it out, ejector here, 6 shots, fixed sights. And notice how the ejector is not supported. There's no lug. That's exactly how we know the revolver dropped out of the car is not a Colt Police, and that we can identify it as a Smith & Wesson because it does have the lug under the barrel. Also, we see a lanyard ring on it. The Victory model was, of course, introduced in late 1941, although the full Victory with phosphate finish and slab wood grips would not appear till 42, and they would produce nearly 600,000 of these, being used not only by the U.S. but by the Commonwealth. But it was essentially just a wartime version of Smith & Wesson's M&P Military and Police, which itself was based on the hand ejector, which goes all the way back to 1899, although the modern lock work really appeared with the 4th model in 1915, so just prior to World War I. And these could be had in all kinds of calibers, but this version was based on the original 38 long, which evolved to 38 Smith & Wesson, and then 38 Special. The cylinder latch you push forward as opposed to pull back on a Colt. Pop it out, ejector, and like I said, it does have a lug in the front. It too has a single double action, and rather famously it rotates to the left, whereas a Colt rotates to the right. I don't like dry firing these, but I'll do it for you guys a couple of times. So these are the revolvers seen by indie fans in the film. Again, they're probably supposed to be the same revolver, but props, and they probably had reasons for wanting to drop a Smith & Wesson out of a car versus the Colt at the time. And after Willie does drop the hot gun out of the car, I don't know how hot a revolver barrel can be, but alright. For the rest of the film, Dr. Jones, Indy, really doesn't have a gun. He has an empty holster. Next up, the Webley. We see 38 caliber Webleys in the hands of Chin and other members of the gang in the opening scene and the chase scene. We also see more Colts and Smith & Wessons in various hands. And they're not the 455 large frame version. They're actually the smaller 38 frame. Now this is my wartime Mark IV in 38-200. Before this they did some officially in 38 Smith & Wesson, and before that 38 black powder essentially. In the film we actually see a Mark III, and it's chromed or nickeled with a shorter barrel. Rather than 4 or 5 inches, it's actually 3. So this isn't exactly right, but mechanically it's the same. The Mark IV was a militarized version of the Mark III, which itself was introduced by Webley and Scott for police, law enforcement, and civilian sales, and definitely would have been in service and circulation in the area in 1935. So again, quite correct for what it is. These were used by Hong Kong police, Singapore police, and many others, really through the 1960s. And it's your classic Webley. Of course, double, single action with the unique Smith & Wesson inspired top brake system, auto ejecting, Again, Chin's in the film is a short nickel or chromed version, probably with wood grips, but I'm not sure. And this is the military, so it's what I got though, and mechanically it's the same. These are actually a lot of fun and well made, and there's a very interesting story comparing this with Lee-Enfield's No.II revolver that we've talked about in the past, and you can read up on as well. Mechanically, very different from the Colt and Smith & Wesson, but still kind of in the same class of revolver. While the club scene mostly shows us handguns, there is one machine gun, or rather submachine gun, the very famous Thompson, first made by Colt, later Auto Ordnance, and we see it in the film a few times, both in the club and the chase scene. This is of course 45 ACP, and the one in the film changes up a bit as well. And frankly, it's hard to exactly pin it down. It seems to be a bit of a mutt, but I brought out my model 1928A1 because the one in the film very clearly has a 50-round drum, and your later M1s, which to be fair weren't introduced until World War II anyway, would not take a drum. On the other hand, the one in the film has a simplified rear sight and a non-finned barrel, and between scenes sometimes does, sometimes doesn't have the cuts compensator. Also, it does have the kind of gangster style vertical foregrip, which would have been the original model 1928. The A1 has the straight handguard. This would have definitely been possible in 1935, and one of the handful of submachine guns available, and for that scene and what was going on with gangsters, it's actually very appropriate. For anyone new to the channel, mine here is actually built from original parts, but it is converted to semi-auto only. Even the receiver is original, which is nice to have preserved the markings. It does have the detachable buttstock. And yeah, I really think it was appropriate for the film. No real criticisms. A quintessential 1930s gun, along with the revolvers, very cops and robbers, very fitting for the day and time. Also fitting for the day and time, seen in the hands of Chinese guards, is a German Mauser Model 98, Gewehr 98, G98 of World War I vintage, with the long 30-inch barrel, straight bolt handle, so-called roller coaster rear sight, and chambered for 8mm Mauser 7.92 by 57 with an internal 5-round magazine. This was pretty much the pinnacle of Paul Mauser's designs and his best produced bolt action. And after World War I, these would flood the world, and China would end up with several. They would also produce a unique variant of the Mauser in China based on a Steyr design, and quite iconic, but pretty rare today. You can tell the Gewehr 98 was made at a time before the short rifle concept had really taken hold worldwide, and that would include China. So not really in the film much, just kind of a background gun, but very appropriate. And that gets us kind of out of the introduction scene and into the Temple of Doom era. And there we don't see a lot of guns. There are a couple of revolvers in the hands of the Thuggee, and they do have a few single shot old Martini Henrys. I don't have one of those because they're primarily in black powder, and I don't collect black powder. I do smokeless, so apologies, but I wanted to give a nod and a mention because An old Martini Henry is exactly what you'd expect the Indian temple guards and cultists to kind of have. Secondhand British guns or what have you, things they could afford. Single shots, kind of a hodgepodge. And we don't really see many guns there. In fact, the next major mention comes at the end and is pretty anachronistic. Right after the climax, British colonial troops come in as the cavalry to the rescue. Maybe a little late, but helping with cleanup. At the very least, they at least bandage Dr. Jones's hand. And they are sporting and firing Enfields, which is good. Unfortunately, they're number 4 Mark 1s, or maybe number 4 Mark 2s, just because that's probably what the props department had a lot of in the 1980s. Unfortunately, the number 4 Mark 1 or Mark 2 was not really introduced until 1941, and that would be within England. Actually, in India, they never would make it there, although some would make it there, in the hands of troops. Now, what this was a product improved SMLE Mark 3. Had a slightly longer barrel, a little heavier, and it had aperture rear sights, still an infield action, and detaching 10-round mag. Now, the Mark 1 Star would do away with the takedown catch, and those were built in North America only. The Mark 1s and later the Mark 2s were built and refurbished in the UK. And this is what most said they should have put in the film. And Mark 3, after 1926, known as the number 1 Mark 3. And in fact, this one was made in India, so called the IP or India pattern. So that would have been very appropriate. This is, of course, the very famous cock-on-close system that was so rapid to fire in World War I. That's due in part to the shorter rotation distance and the turn-down handle. The downside is the locking lugs were at the rear of your bolt. This was strong enough for .303 British, which actually started off as a late black powder cartridge, but evolved into early smokeless, but wouldn't be quite strong enough for something more. And this is a short rifle, slightly shorter barrel, slightly lighter gun than a number 4, but it has a more traditional tangent rear sight at the rear of the barrel, giving a shorter sight radius. A lot of cool differences. So this could have been in the film for sure and would have been appropriate. But I have an alternative suggestion, something a little more fun and obscure. An SMLE Mark 5, later number 1 Mark 5. This is an interesting test variant, and the reason I picked it, the guns in the film obviously have a rear sight mounted at the rear of the receiver. Keeping with that theme, so does the Mark 5. In fact, this was the first early test this sight out after the success of the 1917 and P-14 in World War I, at least semi-successful. These were built in the early to mid-20s in the UK as so-called trials or test rifles, and they would build over 20,000. And when they were not adopted as a new standard, many were transferred to the colonies and other outposts. So it's entirely probable that these would have been shifted to colonial troops in India. And while the Mark V would not see true mass production, it would directly lead to the Mark VI, or rather number 1 Mark VI in the early 30s, which itself would directly lead to the number 4 Mark I in 1939, and then put into production in 1941. So this to me would kind of fit in better, and it would kind of keep the same aesthetic for the troops, and maybe be a little unique. Of course, the problem is probably the props department didn't have enough Mark 5s, but I'm just trying to say in our headcanon, we could say instead of number 4 Mark 1s, they actually had Mark 5s, because that would be historically appropriate. And of course, these are all chambered for 303. And that pretty much concludes the film there. Those are the major guns, at least the ones I have and can show you. There were a few random other handguns and a couple of other rifles in the background, but those are the highlights. And with that, we leave India and the Temple of Doom, skipping forward a year to the original, the one, the only, the classic. 1936, Raiders of the Lost Ark. The original, and no, it did not have Indiana Jones' name in the title. Indy's most famous sidearm was actually 2 guns. He says it's okay to call him Indy now. Both are revolvers, both are Smith & Wessons, both are .45 caliber, but different .45 calibers. And these were used interchangeably, really meant to be the same gun throughout Raiders. Essentially, one came from an American armorer prop house, and another came from British, which makes sense. What we have here is a Smith & Wesson hand ejector Mark II. And here, a Smith & Wesson, also a hand ejector. This is a model 1917. British or Commonwealth Army, American, chambered for .45 ACP, chambered for .455 Ely, what they basically called for Webley. These are both large frame, in-frame types, and operate pretty much the same. Double, single action, same type of release. Since this fired a rimmed round, no troubles there. And these had checkered diamond grips with a lanyard loop, and the standard barrel was 6 inches, although the gun used in the film had its barrel chopped down to 4 inches and the front sight moved. Of course, the 1917 operates exactly the same and had a slightly shorter barrel as standard at 5.5 inches, but the prop here too was chopped down to 4 inches. The standard service 1917 had the slab grips, although the later Brazilian contract guns, sometimes called 1917/37s, did have the more traditional commercial grips. And in fact, they did a run of 1917s for the commercial market around 1930. So not all of these went directly to the military. This also has a smooth trigger as opposed to ribbed. And yeah, these are used interchangeably by Indy throughout the film, from the beginning temple scene all the way through Cairo and beyond. This would be a good choice for someone like Indiana. They would be readily available. Revolvers were considered dependable at the time. Automatics were newfangled. The Mark II here first started being ordered by the British in 1915, and they would get them throughout World War I. They would also get a Colt version in the same .455 Ely. And when the U.S. joined the war, they too would get both Colts and Smith & Wessons chambered for .45 ACP. But there was one little hitch. The 45 ACP round was a rimless or recessed rimmed round because it was meant for an automatic. So Smith & Wesson was the one to develop the moon or half moon clips, either 3 or 6 shots, to allow them to extract. They also bored out the cylinder and gave it a shoulder so you could load them in without a half moon, but to get them out you might have to poke them or shake them. Not ideal, but in a pinch, needs must. Whereas the Colts were a little more up for grabs. And as I said, they kept making these in batches post-war, 1930, and in 1937 for Brazil, around 25,000. And these were quite common on the market for many years. A good, dependable gun. Which kind of explains why this was Indy's backup. An FN Herstal Browning High Power, known as the P.35 in military service for its initial year of adoption, 1935, in Belgium. This was actually originally created by John Browning, at least the outline, but he was not able to finalize it before his death, so Durenov-Save would finish it up. And it was meant to go for the French trials, and it did, but it didn't win out, being defeated by the Model 1935A. So instead, Belgium adopted it. This one here is a wartime production, made in Belgium under German occupation. And this is completely anachronistic for what Indy would have carried for a number of reasons. Now, this was a great pistol for its day and time. Double stack magazine. But still single action only. It's a legend, really is. We see him using a FN made high power in Nepal in the bar scene. And it really doesn't fit because, again, the film's in 1936 and these were barely produced and they were not sold in North America at the time at all. And speaking of North America, this is the one we see him using originally as his backup gun. But as we get to the ship scene, it gets even more anachronistic. We see Indy with another high power variant. This one from Inglis, John Inglis of Canada. Now these were produced under license, but we see the number 2. The number 1 obviously came first, and it was a tangent sight version. The problem is these didn't even begin production until 1944, and most number 2s came in 1945, so it's almost a decade too late. Even though the Canadian high power is kind of my favorite. And these definitely did serve the Allies and filtered their way through. But definitely would not have been carried by an archaeologist slash professor slash adventurer in 1936. So why did they do this? Why the high power? Why was this the backup gun? I mean, 13 plus 1 versus 6. This would honestly seem like this should be the primary. Well, it had to do with movie stuff. The original plan was to have a Colt 1911, another John Browning design from earlier, as Indy's backup. And this actually would make sense. It fires the same 45 as the Revolver, but because it was considered an automatic and therefore maybe not as reliable, yeah, make it your backup or secondary gun. But instead they went with the high power. That's because it fired 9x19, 9mm Luger Parabellum, and that was really for blank firing. It just worked better as a blank gun versus 45. Obviously in a revolver it wouldn't really matter because you wouldn't have to worry about cycling the action. And to be fair, the general lines are the same on screen as a secondary gun. It's at least a John Browning design, single action, okay, fine. Again, I'll permit it because I understand that's frankly how movies work. One gun they really did get quite right, or one handgun rather, is the good old C96, aka the Broomhandle Mauser. Now this one here is in 9mm, and I don't know if the one in the film was also a 9, which would make sense for blank purposes, or if it was the more standard 7.63 Mauser. Either way, we see this used in Nepal again, and that's actually a very good choice. This gun had been on the market since the late 19th century, and was very popular in Asia. So seeing these in Nepal makes perfect sense, and with its long 5.5-inch barrel, adjustable rear sight, 10-shot magazine, even if it had to be topped off with stripper clips, it makes perfect sense when we see it in kind of the hands of thugs and enforcers. Top it off with clips. Just a cool, classic piece of history. And it makes a couple of brief appearances in Raiders. Unfortunately, now we have to move to another rather blatant inaccuracy, historically speaking. The Walther P-38, seen in the hands of Major Colt, at least famously, but also in the hands of the German pilot and a few others. Now, correct, this was the standard German sidearm in World War II, but as the name might belie, it was not adopted until 1938. Even worse, the German military really didn't even get the first test batches and prototypes until late 39, early 1940. So no way would these be in Egypt in 1936. I brought up my earliest example. This one's a Swedish contract, HP, from 1939. The earliest German ones looked the same. They were called 0 Series. And there are some noteworthy differences. For one, it has more commercial markings. For another, the early style checkered grips. That's really what you can see on screen. But there are many smaller differences, like a different firing pin, different sights, different hammer. Of course, this did fire 9x19 and was pretty well suited for blanks because of its very open top design. Hard for a round to get stuck in there, and even if it did, it'd be easy to clear. It has a very prominent extractor, at least compared to a lot of other pistols, so I kind of understand why they did it. But what should they have used instead? Coming as little surprise to anyone, one of the top 3 most famous German guns of all time, the pistol 1908, the P08, so-called Luger. And to Raiders' credit, we do see these in Colonel Dietrich's holster. We also see them in other German officers' holsters, and even being shot some. But the Luger, while more reliable than sometimes it gets credit for, was not especially fond of blanks because of its very curved magazine and just the way the feed worked in general. So I would imagine they found that the P-38 was just easier to work with. Or it could have been another case of 2 different production armor facilities supplying different guns. Or just a number. But we did see Lugers, but the P-38 being in the film was made more famous because of the Major. And this definitely was the standard. You really didn't start to see the Luger being replaced until about 1941, and even then it was a gradual process. And they were still very much building these. They would switch from DWM to Simpson to Mauser and Krieghoff in the 1930s. So production, manufacturing would continue until 1942, with the final ones delivered in 1943. Cool gun. It's a Luger. You know it, you love it. Both are iconic. One of them is just much more fitting for the film. We certainly covered quite a few handguns, and let's move on to a gun firing the same 9mm cartridge, the submachine gun of the film, and another very famous inaccuracy, the German MK.40. Yes, it began as the MK.38, the pre-war spiffier version. But guess what? The MK.38 was not adopted until 1938. And again, really didn't start to see widespread use until 1940 or even later. And you would not expect to see these in Egypt and other far-flung places. In fact, Germany didn't really have any forces in Egypt at the time because it was not under German control in 1936. But I digress. The point is, we actually see a lot of these. They're in the hands of various locals, as well as the Germans themselves. Now, to its point, this is identifiably a German submachine gun. So, you see it, you think, yep, that's for Germans. But, yeah, it didn't, it didn't really work out, but in a fun way. What should they have used instead? Something more like this. Now this is a British copy of a German MK.28 so-called Bergman. This is a sterling-made Lanchester. And a lot of countries copied the MK.28. A lot of them. In fact, a lot of this era of subgun was inspired by this. So it works. It's as close as I've got. And it is a closer fit, even though, yes, the Lanchester wasn't made until 1940 itself. But it's based on that gun that would have been quite available at the time and would have worked. There were a few others, but this would have been the most common and most affordable. Submachine guns really hadn't come into their own yet in 1936. In fact, a lot of people were asking in militaries, what's the use, what's the purpose? Kind of like people today ask, what's the purpose of a PCC? And one other thing is a little infamous about the MP40s seen in Raiders. That is, how the soldiers are holding them. There's a right way and a wrong way. And to demonstrate, let's get a little assistance from Indy's good longtime friend Belloc, or Belloc as the Germans called him. This is the correct way to hold an MP.38 or MP.40, with the offhand in the center behind the magwell. So in this area here. Works with the stock folded or deployed. And this is the incorrect, even the ill-advised way, with the offhand around the magazine itself. Some guns have enough of a magwell hanging down you can grab it, but not the MP.38, MP.40. So your hand's going to automatically go around the magazine. This is a double stack single feed mag. Rather notorious for not always being the most reliable in the first place. So if you grip it here, your hand can very easily shift the magazine, giving improper feed angles and leading to jams, other failures, doubles, what have you. Now, some in the film grip it correctly, and some do not. But rather famously, the Germans grip it the wrong way. And it's actually the Arabs who tend to handle it correctly, by meaning those actors or that director knew a thing or two more. Thanks, Belach. While we have quite a few handguns in Raiders, we only have the one submachine gun, and really only have only one rifle of note. A Kar-98K, a Mauser, a Model 98 action, 8mm, 7.92. The carbine, or rather the short rifle version, because it's a 23 and some change inch barrel, so not a true carbine, of the Gewehr 98 we looked at earlier. In the film, this isn't too out of place. Germany certainly had plenty of Gewehr 98s from World War I. There were other options made in Europe that had the shorter barrel. And Mauser did start up production of the 98K in 1934 and 35, but they were pretty low rate. It really wasn't until 1936, 37 that production numbers would go up. And this is a pretty early example, no front sight hood. So a year or two out of date for 1936, but not too bad. I could put up with it, but there would be one other alternative. If you really wanted to be period correct, but you still wanted the shorter, not quite 2-foot barrel Mauser, you could have given the soldiers a Kar-98A, a K98A. This was the compact version used in World War I, and many did survive into the Weimar era and were reissued from time to time and refurbished. Also, copies were made in Poland. As you can tell, the K is very much inspired by the A, although in actuality, the Kar-98K is a direct cut-down version of a Kar-98B. That's kind of getting a little too detailed. You can definitely tell, turn-down bolt handle. We have a more extensive forearm. But in a lot of ways, yeah, this was the direct forerunner. And again, if that's just what you wanted, that would have fit well in the film. So I thought I would mention it. But really, the 98K isn't terribly out of place, all things considered. And there you have it. Quite a few more handguns in the film, although still just one submachine gun and one rifle primarily viewed. It was more of an interpersonal story, more close that way. And just FYI to anyone who cares, yes, this is a semi-automatic, legal, as was the other one we looked at. These are all original and essentially as correct as I can make them, except for the Smith & Wessons not having 4-inch barrels and the different sight. And I picked the early HP P38 just to show you what could have possibly been. So what do you think? Do the inaccuracies matter? Does the need to fire 9mm explain them? Does it bug you? Or do you not care because it was just a fun Hollywood adventure film based on 1930s serials? Let me know. 1938. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Junior? Sorry. Henry Jones Jr. Ph.D. had traded in his Smith & Wesson for a true British gun, a classic, a Webley. Now in the film he uses props based around the Webley government, the WG model. This was a commercial version that could and was very often customized, and they went back all the way to the 1880s, with really the final versions made in the early 20th century in 455 Ely, 455 Webley. And I don't have a WG exactly, but I do have a military service Mark V and Mark VI, and really they're the same. The Mark V, introduced in 1913, was essentially a beefed up version of the military Webley, really made for smokeless powder. But in other ways, it was very, very similar to the Mark IV, known as the Boer War model, and it, of course, drew upon the previous Mark IIIs, Mark IIs, and the original Mark I. Most of the changes were quite small. A few were more important, like the disassembly, but really by this point, they're pretty much the same. This is a double single action system with a heck of a firing pin, almost a firing nail on the hammer, and it does not flex. It does have a curve though. Like a lot of older versions, including a lot of WGs, it has the classic bird's head grip with lanyard ring. The WG had a lanyard ring as well. This was done really because it felt good and made reloading fast and easy, and I think looked cool too. This has a somewhat shorter barrel at 5 inches, holding 6 rounds of 455. Classic top break. Bloop. So essentially, the larger, elder, big brother of the Mark IV we looked at the beginning. Very quick to reload. This style, especially with this type of grip, was optimized for use on horseback. The only downside to the system, because the frame was split in two, it wasn't the strongest. It was strong enough for 455, but you really couldn't do, say, a 357 Magnum, not reliably. Fixed rear sight, although some of your WGs had target rear sights. Fixed front. These were produced up until 1915 and World War I, at which time the Mark VI became the new standard. It's worth pointing out that up until 1915, British officers private purchased their sidearms, but 1916 rolls around, World War I, they start to be issued, and this was a version of the Webley meant for issuance, especially use in the trenches, with a long 6-inch barrel. We have the more squared off, more modern looking grip. This was actually trialed out on the WG target model. Same, sorry it's stiff there. Top break disassembly. Heck, they even made a bayonet for these for use in the trenches. So why did Junior switch over to one in 1938? Maybe he just developed some class. It is classy, and it does have some benefits. Again, it is easier to reload because ejection is automatic. Opens right up at the top. It is a little heavy, but 455 is not exactly a slouch. It's a train coming at you. So I get it. And for what it's worth, this would seem to be the sidearm that Junior would decide to carry for the rest of his life, because we see it on his hip in the 1950s as well. The reason I brought both of these out, the WG could be purchased in so many configuration and barrel lengths and even finishes. The standard one, though, typically has the bird's head grip, but the longer 6-inch barrel. Now, since I can't actually see screenshots of the film, I'm not sure which variant Junior had. I would imagine he might have gone for a shorter barrel, since that seems to be his MO, but I could be wrong. And we see him using this sidearm throughout the film. Right up until the end, really. Crusade has quite a few repeat firearms, makes sense, including more MP40s. Since it does take place in 1938, some try to excuse these as MP.38s. Nice try, but again, they weren't in the field yet, but okay, a little bit closer. We do see more Walther P.38s, same deal. A lot of them more wartime guns like this one. I've got a friend that loves this kind of color grip on these. And you see more Lugers, which are still very appropriate, including with Colonel Vogel in the film. So these are repeats in German hands, but we do get one new German firearm. Is it appropriate? Walthers are always appropriate. A PPK in the hands of Walter Donovan. So this is appropriate in every way. It's the exact kind of gun a wealthy person like him would carry, or any high-ranking officer for that matter. And first introduced in 1931, there were plenty of years for him to pick these up, and in fact we do see German officers carrying these, because by 1938 the Third Reich is in full swing and annexing Czechoslovakia and so on and so forth. So yeah, the PPK fits in very well. And if you're wondering if it was put into the film because of Sean Connery, yes it was. Of course, in a turn of irony, it wasn't used by him, it was used on him. And I grabbed my Manierchen, my French-made example, post-war, because the one in the film was most definitely, well, most very likely, not a pre-war example. It may have been French, but it actually seems like it could have been one of the US-made Inner Arms PPKs. And if that's the case, you can tell a lot of those had a stainless steel finish, whereas the German/French ones did not. And a lot of those were in 380, whereas most of your French and German ones were in 7.65, especially in military use. So he could have had one like this that he chromed or nickeled. Would not have been stainless, and most likely would not have been in 9mm curves. And a couple other people in the film, namely Germans, are seen with these in holsters. But yeah, Donovan rather pointedly uses this at the apex, at the crescendo of the film, to put a bit of a timer on Junior's quest. And you're never going to hear me complain about seeing PPKs in films. Moving on from the Germans, another organization, a brotherhood we find in the film, is the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword. And at first they're presented as adversaries, villains, obstacles, but later they become allies. And their leader is Kazim, and they actually get his submachine gun right. But he also uses a broomhandle Mauser. We see this in Venice. He also uses it to bean Marcus Brody in the head. And these would have been very common in Italy and other places, because the Italian Navy, almost everyone used broom handles at one point or another. So that fits in perfectly. But that's not as important or interesting as talking about what he originally appears with, the MP.28 Bergman. Like I said, this is the British copy. It's the best I got, but it's quite close. But why doesn't he use this throughout the entire scene? Well, it breaks or malfunctions, and it's kind of unusual. When Kazim attempts to use it, for some reason the catch back here is switched off, which is part of the takedown system. This one's really stiff. Let me show you in just a second. So yeah, it's the catch, and then it's a tube gun, and it opens up, and from there this rear cap comes off and you can disassemble your gun. Now this is a semi-auto conversion, so it's closed bolt, so it's different. Sorry, I'm not trying to get in any hot water with YouTube here and their whole gunsmithing thing. But see, it pivots in the front on a big screw. And you'd think he would have just, you know, done this and just closed it back up and refastened it. It's not very hard. Even though this is the British copy, the Bergman works the same. But no, he throws it away and pulls out his broom handle to do some sweeping. Interesting character in a very dapper suit. Another interesting 9mm submachine gun we see in the film is a modified version of one of these. This is an Italian Beretta MAB 3842. So yeah, it wasn't actually put into production until 1942 or 43, but that doesn't matter because the whole point of this, it was put in the plane they steal from the blimp, the Zeppelin, and two were put together to try to mock up another Italian submachine gun, and in fact what you might argue to be the world's first production submachine gun, the Model 1915 Villa Perosa, which, yeah, the Villa Perosa was used on airplanes in World War I. Was it a terribly convincing job? No, but at least it was Italian, and at least it was meant to mock up an Italian gun. And since I have an affinity for Berettas, I couldn't resist talking about it. This is one of my kind of favorite little guns. Made it into a pistol. It's an original. You can tell it has the ribbed receiver, so it's actually kind of inspired by the MP.40 itself, and then the shortened barrel with flutes. The later versions would even do away with the flutes to save on machining, so on and so forth. But yeah, it was in the film. Thought I'd mention it, even if it was kind of standing in for something else. Temple gave us a lot of revolvers and a lot of swords play. Big knives, swords, that kind of thing. Raiders gave us a lot of handguns, mostly automatic at that. Well, Crusade gives us a lot of rifles, at least more than most. And we have two main variants seen in the hands of the Germans. A Kar 98K again, and an M43. The 98K we've already talked about. This is the backbone of the Wehrmacht during World War II. They produced around 14 million of them, all kinds of variations. But of course the film crew had access to what they had access to. In the 1980s, a lot of the guns that we'd eventually get out of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union or former Soviet Union weren't here yet. So they used other sources. I picked this one because it's actually a Mauser built under orders and occupation by the French at the Mauser factory in Oberndorf. Not saying they used these in the film, but this would have been something they had access to. And whereas the first one we looked at for Raiders was an early one, this is a late one with the cupped butt plate, the stamped trigger guard and mag, welded together barrel bands. This one did not have a front side hood because of late war. But yeah, still 8mm, still the classic and wonderful Paul Mauser Model 98 system with internal 5-round magazine. One of the best bolt actions of all time. And we do see these in the hands of the Germans. And yeah, this would be appropriate in 1938. It would have been a new introduction, the K98K, but by this point they had been making them for 3 or 4 years, and they could have got around. This one, on the other hand, was not only not introduced until 1943, so 5 years later, but is a Spanish take on the Model 98. This variant has a straight bolt handle for what it's worth. More traditional bottom mounted sling swivels, but it does have the short top handguard, pretty traditional rear sight. Has an interesting bayonet lock assembly here, where they let it take the older 93 pattern Mauser bayonets just to be compatible. No front side hood. Pretty standard 98 action. I don't blame them at all for using it with the Germans. Them Spanish guns were quite available in the 1980s, so why not use them? It works fine, especially at a distance. It's fine. It's fine. So what else? The third act of the film takes place in the Republic of Hatay, or Hatay. If you don't know the name, don't worry. It only existed for, well, really less than 2 years, from 1937 to 1939. So 1938 would have been exactly smack dab in the middle. And this is the short rifle carbine we see its soldiers equipped with, and it actually fits just fine because these kind of walked around the world. This is the Mauser model 1895, typically Chilean. This is an older Mauser style, whereas these are the large ring 98 actions. This is the earlier, smaller style. Basically, the 95 is a product improved 93, and it's set you down here on a cock on close system with different safety, but it does have the internal 5-round mag, turn down bolt handle, and fires 7mm 7x57. Note the bayonet lug, the older style, and the shorter rear sight. And there's all kinds of variations of these. I'm not saying this exact variant was in the film, but those soldiers did use a variant of the 1895, and here you go. One of the Chileans. But we still have more Mausers. And for these, we return to Qasim's Brotherhood. In fact, we see him with this gun. Also based on the M1893 action, this is a Spanish model 1916 short rifle. This too is chambered for 7mm. This too has the integral double stack 5-round mag. This one has the roller coaster style rear sights, but there are different sights used on these. It has a partially exposed barrel, half upper handguard, the older style bayonet lug, and a quite unique protected front sight. That's kind of a giveaway on these. That and how the barrel sticks out more. 1916s were made in Spain for a very long time, and really was their own design. Oh, and this one also has a hinged floor plate with release in the trigger guard. Lots of variations in them though. While they were originally in 7mm, many you find in the US today are actually chambered for 7.62 by 51 CETME, commonly marked as 308. Not getting into that debate here now, it's not relevant. But I could definitely see someone like Qasim, who probably had connections in Spain or wherever, getting his hands on these. And since it's relatively short and light, and the 7mm cartridge is known for very good accuracy at distance, this would make sense. Certainly a lot more sense than a heavy Gewehr 98. And our second Mauser seen in the hands of the Brotherhood, and our actually last one, at least major one in the film, and one of the most successful Mausers of all time, quite possibly the most successful pattern of the interwar period. We're returning to the 98 large ring system, and we're returning to 8mm with this one, although many were also produced in 7mm, especially for South American contracts. The Czechoslovakian Brun, depending on if you're German or Czech, Visor VZ-24 short rifle. After the Great War, the new nation of Czechoslovakia found itself with some German manufacturing facilities for Mausers. And in the beginning, they essentially cloned the Gewehr 98 and others. But by 1924, they were ready to do their own thing, a short rifle. Now, yes, it was based somewhat on the Kar 98A, but it had a lot of features unique, and a lot that directly inspired Germany's own 98K. Imitation, you know what they say. Now, this is a straight bolt handle, but we have a semi-pistol grip stock. Interestingly, we have a full-length upper handguard, traditional flat rear sights, quite an interesting front sight protector. It is removable though. Pretty standard bayonet lug, cleaning rod, all that good stuff. And so these could be used by both infantry, cavalry, artillery, and others. We got dual sling swivels. Again, flipping, here those are. There are variations in these because the Czechs would build these in several patterns for many, many contracts. Within Europe, yes, but also for China, Japan, many others. And like I said, even South America. And this would directly inspire and be what the Persian Mauser was based on. It was just very, very successful. And I could definitely see the Brotherhood having these in 1938. They're a little heavier and a little longer than the 1916, but frankly, they had better build quality, they were a little more accurate, and the 98 system was more robust and more dependable than the older 93 that the 16 was based on. So both of them make perfect sense. And the VZ-24 was definitely used by the Germans during World War II. Really, right after they annexed Czechoslovakia, they confiscated miniguns like this. So these are all very similar. They're all in that short rifle classification, but also different. But that kind of gets into the craziness of us Mauser collectors, right? Alright, so as you can tell, we have a lot of rifles in this film, which makes sense. There's a lot of outdoor scenes, Venice, and of course all the goings on in the desert. We get a couple of new pistols. Of course, Junior changes his sidearm yet again, but I guess third time's the charm because it sticks with him throughout Kingdom of the Crystal Skull as well, which is 20 years later. We get a couple more submachine guns. Even though they still do the thing with the MP.40, at least they get the MP.28 right. So that's kind of a neat gun. It's very iconic for the era. And the inclusion of the PPK is not only very appropriate, but also kind of funny with regards to Sean Connery. So what do you think? All the guns in the films are important for atmosphere, even if they're not necessarily quite chronologically there. But we have to end by comparing Indy or Professor Jones, Dr. Jones, or Henry Jones Jr.'s choice of sidearm. Since this is what we see him using, a Colt, it's really only we see the Smith & Wesson a few times. This would seem to be what he really uses. Kind of the same thing. We see both the British and the 1917, but since this is, I believe, what he has in Cairo, we'll have this. And I went with the long barrel Webley just for now. So which is better? Which is worse? What's better for him? Well, in some ways, they each kind of suit the film they're in. Little 38s like this were everywhere in police service in the 1930s, including where he was at in Shanghai. Makes sense. Relatively light, easy to carry if you're wearing a dinner jacket, a suit. 38 special. Some of them even 38 Smith & Wesson. Not the most potent, but since body armor wasn't common then, it would do the job, especially if you didn't expect to be going into combat, but, you know, prepare for anything. That said, I'm not as big of a fan of Colts as I am Smith & Wessons in general. I don't like the unsupported ejector as much, and sometimes they can be a little more finicky, and I don't like the way you pull back on the cylinder latch. These are very small things, but we're just talking. I think this is appropriate for Temple, but I think he learned a lesson or two here. Which explains why he upgraded to a 45 or 455. More of a punch. Now he did cut his barrels down, or they were cut down to 4 inches, so very similar to a lot of the 38s. So good for concealability. Either way, I think he too went to Smith & Wessons. I like the latch more. I like the supported ejector. These are readily available. Spare parts were available. The cartridge was available. And considering he was in South America and the Middle East, although he was in Nepal too, finding ammo and everything, it fit the post-World War I environment very well. The only downside to these, if you were going for the 45 version, would be using half moon or moon clips. Now, a workaround, you could have 45 auto rim, which was basically, 45 ACP with the rim built in, specifically for the Colt or Smith & Wesson 1917. Of course, if you used the 455 Ely, this wasn't a concern because it had a rim. Either way, made sense, and that's the only major drawback I can think of to this gun. They were well made and plentiful, and I just like a Smith & Wesson more. What can I say? So why did he switch to a Webley in 1938? Maybe it's just style. I don't know. It is easier to manipulate, certainly unload single-handed. Drop rounds in and close it up. So generally these are faster. And the 455 cartridge should be plenty powerful for what he needs. I'm still going with style. And he must have agreed, because like I said, he stuck on to his Webley WG. And though the factory had stopped making them by the time of the films, if he had been around at that time, he could have ordered one custom any way he really wanted it. Then again, Smith & Wesson and Colt did lots of custom guns too. But no, really good quality, good reputation. These proved quite good in the trenches, the mud, the dirt of the war. But yeah, I'm going with style. And in fact, I think style was kind of Junior's name of the game in that film. What do you think? And here's the Indy that goes with the Webley. See, he's looking dapper with a tie. And the one that goes with the 1917. And finally, the one that goes with the Colt or Smith & Wesson. These are, of course, the ones I've been kind of just teasing throughout the video from the newer collection. Temple of Doom Indy, Raiders Indy, and Last Crusade Indy. Why not for fun? He certainly went to the ringer in that one. I do videos on models and toys and other things on my personal Misha channel, so if you like to nerd out and have fun, you can go check it out over there. Because that's what this is all about. Just having fun. With guns or otherwise. So I'm curious, which one is your favorite film? And this can be separate, which is your favorite kind of look for him? There's a bit of a scrappy underdog look from Temple. He definitely gets beat up, maybe the most in that film. Raiders, well, he gets beat up a lot there too. But at least he gets some wins and he gets to kind of world travel. And in Crusade, we see him with his father, and yeah, he's a little more put together. He doesn't quite get beat up as much. And it really is kind of funny, the revolvers that he carries do kind of illustrate that. At any rate, appreciate you tuning in. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, check out the Patreon, and I've been doing live streams now and again, so stop in and say hi. One of those. This is Misha, and also on behalf of Fox, because actually I did this because of him. Indiana Jones is maybe his favorite franchise, and it seemed like a good topic for an early Thanksgiving Day video. Catch you very soon, next time.